Welcome to the HoosLeft podcast, a show about Indiana politics, history, and culture from the unapologetic perspective of the Hoosier left. My name is Scott Aaron Rogers, and I'm recording from Bloomington. So, this summer, sprinkled in amongst interviews with candidates for state and local office here in Indiana, HoosLeft has taken time to closely examine Christian nationalism, one of the major ideological trends driving the Republican Party's descent into authoritarian Trumpism, and a motivating factor for some of the most extreme policies implemented by our state government in Indianapolis. First, we used the selection of Micah Beckwith, a charismatic Noblesville pastor and avowed Christian nationalist, as Mike Braun's gubernatorial running mate, to jump into the topic with IU Indianapolis sociology professor Dr. Andrew Whitehead. He gave us a fantastic intro back in episode 41. Then, in episode 46, Dr. Matthew Taylor from the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies introduced us to the New Apostolic Reformation, a dangerous network of Christian dominionists committed to conquering every sphere of cultural influence and building the kingdom of God on earth through spiritual warfare, who had a direct line to the Trump White House and a prominent role in organizing the attempted insurrection of January 6, 2021. One of the recurring characters in my conversation with Dr. Taylor was a guy named Dutch Sheets, one of the more influential apostles in the movement. In addition to the influential daily Give Him 15 prayer videos Beckwith parrots, Sheets is also responsible for the introduction of the Appeal to Heaven flag as a symbol of religious zealot solidarity. The flag, which depicts a green pine tree on a white background, originally dates to the American Revolution, but has been co-opted by Sheets, the NAR, and the larger Christian nationalist movement in recent years. Had been flown prominently at the Capitol on January 6th, and further came into public consciousness earlier this year when it was revealed Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito had flown the flag outside his Jersey Shore beach home last summer. But Alito is not an evangelical Protestant or a charismatic Pentecostal. He is famously extremely Catholic, as is fellow conservative Justice Clarence Thomas, as is Thomas's close friend Leonard Leo, the longtime executive vice president of the Federalist Society. Leo, who, according to his biography at the Catholic Information Center, has, quote, assisted 2 presidential administrations on judicial selection as an outside advisor, and participated in the Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett Supreme Court selection and confirmation process, as well as the outside coalition efforts in support of the Roberts and Alito U.S. Supreme Court confirmations, end quote, was also caught flying the Appeal to Heaven flag outside his home in Maine. A far cry from no Irish need apply signs in the mid to late 1800s and discrimination against Eastern and Southern European immigrants in the early 1900s, Catholicism has long since become an integral part of the American cultural fabric. Currently, 20 to 25% of the U.S. population identifies as Catholic, a significant minority certainly, but one day you wake up and realize the highest court in the land has been stacked with Roman Catholic justices. 6 or 7 out of the 9, depending on how you count the Catholic-raised Episcopalian convert Neil Gorsuch. And for many of us, that day was June 24th, 2022, when this deeply unrepresentative court handed down the Alito-written decision in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, overturning nearly 50 years of precedent and marking the first time in history that the Supreme Court has taken away a fundamental right. And this quiet coup is not limited to the federal government. By overturning Roe v. Wade and sending the matter back to the states, Leo's hand-picked court put women's intimate reproductive health care decisions in the hands of a different subset of religious extremists, like the aforementioned Beckwith, his running mate and conservative Roman Catholic Mike Braun, and current Indiana Attorney General Todd Rokita, another far-right Catholic fundamentalist who has spent the last 4 years implementing the Christian nationalist playbook here in the Hoosier state. Unlike most trends, which get to Indiana after the rest of the country, Project 2025 is already here. The foreman on that project, Heritage Foundation President Kevin Roberts, the guy who threatened political violence recently by saying, quote, "We are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be," end quote. Another radical Catholic with ties to the secretive Opus Dei organization. Roberts' upcoming book, Dawn's Early Light, Taking Back Washington to Save America, originally subtitled Burning Down Washington to Save America, includes a foreword written by yet another ultra-Catholic fanatic, Vice Presidential nominee J.D. Vance. So, given all this, I had to stop and ask, are Catholics doing Christian nationalism too? I thought that was just a Protestant thing. But just look at the court and these other guys. How did we come from a place 100 years ago where Catholics in America were an oppressed minority, targets of anti-immigrant legislation and harassment by the KKK, to now, where a network of Catholic hardliners sit at the height of political power? Are they working hand in hand with evangelical Protestant and apostolic Pentecostal Christian nationalists? And what does that mean for the future of religious freedom in America? As I ended my conversation with Matthew Taylor, I asked him who I should talk to about the fundamentalist Catholic movement in the U.S., and he pointed me to today's guest. Dr. Karen Park is professor of theology and religious studies at St. Norbert College in Des Peres, Wisconsin. She has written widely on Marian devotion and shrines and American religion and popular culture, with work appearing in Religion Dispatches and Sojourners. She holds a Ph.D. from the Divinity School of the University of Chicago and co-edited the book American Patroness, Marian Shrines and the Making of U.S. Catholicism, a collection of 12 essays that examine the historical and contemporary roles of Marian shrines in U.S. Catholicism, released in early 2024 by Fordham University Press. Before we turn to that interview, please consider supporting Who's Left financially. I currently work full-time as an independent craftsman and work on this project whenever I can. There are so many more things I want to do here at Who's Left, more campaign finance research, maybe live hangouts if y'all are interested, a daily episode if we can get there. But I need your help. If you can, visit scottaaronrogers.substack.com and subscribe at the paid level. For $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help me push our state in a better direction, and maybe, if we reach critical mass, I can put down my tool belt and devote my full time to you, to this project, and to Indiana's future. So, if you have the means, pause right now, go to scottaaronrogers.substack.com, and subscribe at the paid level. And while the best way to help this project is a financial contribution, if you can't afford it at this time, you can still help. Subscribe at the free level over on Substack. Set your favorite podcast player to auto-download new episodes of the show. Rate and review the show on whatever platform you use. This helps the algorithm to help new people find us. Follow me on social media at facebook.com/whosleft. That's HOOS left. I'm also on Blue Sky at the same handle. On Instagram, Threads, and Twitter, I'm at ScottRodge78, and on Mastodon at ScottRodge78 at Hoosier.social. Full video episodes of the pod are available on YouTube with clips on TikTok. The handle of both of those is at Who's Left. Please subscribe on whichever platforms you use and send me a DM to discuss ideas for the project. But most importantly, share our message. Forward the articles to friend, family, and colleagues. Don't just like, but share wildly and widely on social media. Invite others to this community, the black sheep of the Indiana left. I might be the guy with the microphone, but I try to take this thing where your input leads me. So be generous with feedback, good, bad, or indifferent. I value it all. To those who have joined this community already, especially those paid subscribers, thank you so much. I'm honored by your support. And to everybody, thanks for listening. Now here's my interview with Karen Park. Dr. Karen Park, welcome to the Who's Left podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So before we begin, introduce yourself to our listeners and our viewers out there on YouTube and Substack. Tell us a little about yourself.
Yeah. My name is Dr. Karen Park. I'm a professor of theology and religious studies at St. Norbert College, which is a Catholic liberal arts college just outside of Green Bay, Wisconsin. I've been there since about 2008. My master's and PhD are in the history of Christianity from the University of Chicago Divinity School, and I'm really interested in American Catholicism and Catholic devotional practices. And over the years, that's sort of become kind of an interest in American Catholics and their political fortunes as well. And so, that's kind of where my research has led. I look at Catholic sacred space, sacred spaces, shrines. You can think of the quintessential site in Indiana, the Lourdes Grotto on the University of Notre Dame campus. I'm very interested in how religious practices leave the text behind and become embodied and sort of expressed in the landscape. And so for Catholics who were outsiders, immigrant newcomers to this country, making their mark on the landscape, whether that be an urban landscape or a rural landscape, was really an important part of assimilating into being American. And so that's kind of like to pinpoint exactly where my research focuses. So I'm not a political scientist. I'm a historian and a person who is very interested in what we would call material religion.
Very good. Thank you for that introduction. So you mentioned about 100 years ago when Catholics were a persecuted minority in this country. And you also mentioned the University of Notre Dame. I grew up about 30 minutes from there in Michigan City. So, just right down the road, as it were.
Right.
And that's the Catholic part of the state up there from Chicago up through Northwest Indiana over the South Bend area. How did we in a big question, right? How did we get from a place where Catholics were a persecuted minority 100 years ago to where we are now, where we've got a Supreme Court that is 2/3 Catholic. We've got a vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, who is out there representing kind of an extreme traditional Catholicism. And our Attorney General here in Indiana, Todd Rokita, talks like your NAR-style Christian nationalists, like I talked about with Dr. Matthew Taylor a while ago, but he is also a radical Catholic. So I guess take us from that place to where we are now, and we can jump off places and explore maybe characters we come across.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating thing to watch, and even in my own lifetime to see and the changes in the place that Catholicism occupies in American religious life, and um, the different, different types of Catholicisms that have come and gone. So I guess it would probably be, I would imagine, good to start at why were Catholics deemed problematic in the first place. So
Mhm.
I teach students at a Catholic college. It's a um, not maybe I think maybe there are probably 60% of my students are Catholic, another 30 or 40% are Lutheran. Wisconsin has a big German population, so
Mm.
German Lutheran.
Mhm.
And then, but of course, like young people everywhere, a lot of them really don't feel super strongly about their religious affiliations, but they are very surprised to learn that Catholics would have ever been seen as a threat to the United States. And how could that possibly be? And so, um, the reasons for that are that, of course, this is a Protestant country. There were Catholics in in Southwest and other places, but the dominant narrative of the Revolutionary War and the colonies and stuff was coming from a Puritan and explicitly anti-Catholic place.
Mhm.
Catholics were very much like we left them behind. The Puritans came here in order to get away from the Church of England, which was too Catholic for them. So Catholics are now coming in in the at the beginning of the 19th century, just a tiny minority. By the end, it's a dominant Christian tradition. They're coming in numbers that are so overwhelming. And the problem with Catholics um, was that a couple of things. They were non-democratic. The Catholic Church, if you haven't noticed, is not a democracy. We don't get to vote
Mhm.
on who's in charge and what the rules are. And of course, this allegiance to the papacy was going to be incompatible with being a constitutional republic. And to be fair, some of those criticisms were well founded. I mean, the Catholic Church of the 19th century was a monarchy. If you look
Mhm.
at the First Vatican Council, which was held in the now I'm going to remember my dates, but I believe the 1860s, there was something called the Syllabus of Errors that was propagated, and right in that it was things that Catholics must believe, and right in there was and cannot believe was Catholics cannot believe that there are multiple religious traditions that are valid. And it's just like, well, we kind of have that in our Constitution. So
Yeah.
you could point if you were a 19th century, you know, um, frontier family or whatever, or worried about the mass immigration of people from Catholic countries, you could point to some documents that would say these people, much as people have done with right, Islam. Look, it says this in
Mm.
the Quran. We can't. That's incompatible, or this is part of Muslim belief and practice. So there were things about the American Catholic Church or the Catholic Church of the 19th century that were, incompatible with the Constitution and things on its face. Catholics were seen as um, wanting to. They threatened traditional family structures. So in the 19th century, we have what is sometimes called the cult of domesticity, or an elevation of the
Mhm.
nuclear family as the place where God is, the structure that God is most pleased with, right?
Well, I feel like there's a lot of that coming back now.
Yeah, exactly, right? This traditionalism. It's like, so we have a father and a mother and two children. Father goes out to work, mother stays home, and her domain is the domestic sphere. This nuclear sort of ideal, and it's always ever just been an ideal, right? It's really doesn't match up to most people's realities, was then sacralized. So once something becomes an ideal, and it's an economic ideal as well. You have to have money to, be able to have somebody stay home and take care of the kids.
Mhm.
Then that becomes what God likes best too, right? So, um, and Catholics had, it's much less visible now, but Catholics had an entire alternative way of organizing themselves around a celibate groups of people of the single sex who live together. So nuns, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Priests. And we don't think too much about nuns anymore, but they were absolutely an obsession of 19th century and early 20th century Protestants. Um, the idea that these women were living together, all kind, gosh, no, God knows what's going on. There's orgies. The second best-selling novel of the 19th century after Uncle Tom's Cabin is a book called The Awful Disclosures of the Hotel Dieu Nunnery. And it's a supposed tale of sexual intrigue in a convent in Montreal. Protestants could not get enough of this book. And it's completely false. It was debunked right away. But,
Huh.
the Victorians were like, "Oh, this is just terrible. Let me read more." Like,
Yeah. This is somebody's got to do something about this incredibly hot smut.
yes. So, I mean, so they were a threat to the the Constitution. But they were also a threat to these like sort of gender norms and family and
Mm,
societal norms. And then interestingly, Catholics were often linked together with Mormons as a dual threat, right? So Mormons also in the early days had polygamy, alternate ways of living, alternate ways of organizing their sexual behavior, and so did Catholics. And so um, this kind of anti-Catholicism came from some of those concerns. Some of this, and then there was also, just sort of your general hatred of immigrants that we see,
mhm.
and people that Italians, for example, and you know about this, but Italian Catholics were the target of lynchings. Southern Italians, in particular, were not imagined to be white, so this
Yeah,
goes
yeah.
into racial identification as well. So Catholics had to figure out a way to get accepted, and it was a process. Some interesting landmarks along the way. In the Cold War, so there were the second and third generation Catholics who had lived,
Mhm.
like, imagine living in major urban centers, were now moving out to the suburbs
Mm,
and eager to prove their true Catholicism, but also their status as true patriots. And in the middle of the 20th century, there was a very strong devotion to Our Lady of Fatima, who is a Marian apparition that occurred during World War I in Portugal. I don't know if you're familiar with this,
I am
but
not.
so Mary appeared to these poor peasant children in Portugal during World War I, and this was a very apocalyptic apparition, and they were all of these secrets. Well, in the middle of the 20th century, this devotion became extremely popular in the United States, and a way to pray for the prevent nuclear war and the attack by Russians during the Cold
Mhm.
War. So Catholic school children. My mother remembers, praying every day in her Catholic school in Milwaukee to Our Lady of Fatima to protect the United States from Russian attack, from nuclear attack. So this devotion was, what could be more Catholic than praying to Mary? What could be more patriotic than being against the godless communist Russians? So there were
Yeah.
these devotional things took hold in the mid 20th century. We, of course, have the presidency of Kennedy, and he was still facing questions that he
Yeah, they thought was he gonna be loyal to the Pope?
and he had to promise, "I won't tell any secrets to the Pope," so there was still, worry about that. And then, there are quite a few things that contributed to where we are now, and I'm not even sure where we should start. But one of them was the Second Vatican Council,
Yep.
which took place in Rome from 1961 to 1965. So, right during the Kennedy years. And the Second Vatican Council was called by Pope John the 23rd. It was a very surprising thing for him to do. He was a very old pope, was considered to be kind of a placeholder. No one expected this kind of thing. And he called,
Like, so imagine like Benedict.
Yeah, and,
in
but
modern
right,
terms. Yeah.
exactly, and he was, just sort of he was sort of like Benedict, but I would say what was different is that John the 23rd was considered to be just very pastoral. He was like a grandfatherly type. He wasn't a intellectual who would call a council. And yet he said that it was time to throw open the windows on this church. It was too stuffy, and let in some fresh air. And that resulted in a reevaluation, systematic reevaluation of every aspect of Catholic doctrine and teaching. So a council isn't just a meeting, it's a meeting of all the world's bishops. And in the understanding of Catholics, it isn't just a meeting either, because when all of those bishops are together looking at the church, the Holy Spirit is guiding them. So it's a form of revelation as well. And
Yeah, like, they only get together, like, when they're picking a new pope,
yeah,
basically,
when the
right? And
cardinals
then
get together when they're
this
picking
stuff,
a pope,
yeah.
and that's not so they have thousands of bishops from all over the world together, systematically looking at the church, and what came from that was a church was quite modernized, and it was a really exciting time for the Catholic Church in America. That we have the changing of architecture, changing of the order of the mass. Things aren't done in Latin, you know, throwing open, for an understanding of the people of God and in a new way. But it was such a dramatic change that it also caused, especially, it caused people to react strongly against it. Too much change. Too much. Is this modernizing? Is this just the liberal 1960s now affecting our unchanging church? Is this feminism? Is this all of this liberal stuff from the 60s just affecting our church? And so
They
that,
probably throw communism in there because they always do.
right, right.
Yeah.
So that led to some divisions, especially within American Catholicism, between traditionalists um, and the people who were actually following Second Vatican Council, which is the truth, right? That is the revelation. According to Catholics, what happens at the council is true, you know, because it's called.
Yeah.
But it was so like so overwhelmingly such overwhelming change that it caused a backlash, and that backlash has been growing very exponentially in recent decades as the Vatican II generation is no longer really in power, or maybe has even passed away. Um,
So the kids are really clamoring to bring the Latin back?
yeah, exactly.
Who
Yes.
knew? Who knew?
So young Catholics, many young Catholics are very much interested in this type of aesthetic and this type of pre-Vatican II type of Catholicism.
Yeah, yeah, you never think about that. Especially from outside Catholicism,
Mhm.
uh, um, it very much seems like, yeah, the Pope says, and that goes down and gets pushed out. I mean, God, I remember like high school level world history and like the papal split and Avignon,
Mhm.
the anti-pope and stuff. It sounds like kind of a modern version of that is brewing.
Yeah, some people are wondering about that. So Francis is a Vatican, I mean, he espouses a lot the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, of course.
Mhm.
But he's also a Jesuit. So Jesuits are, the founders of great universities, and so they're very much about science and reason. He's also from the global South, so very influenced and by liberation theology, which teaches, and is a very important part of Catholic social teaching, that there is a preferential option for the poor. That means that given any situation and trying to make a moral decision, the decision that will benefit the poor must be prioritized, and that Christianity is ultimately a force for liberation of those who are marginalized. He's very, very much a part of that. So those things have led to certain corners of the American and global Catholic Church being opposed to Francis's papacy, and even in some cases calling it illegitimate. He is, and he has reacted strongly uh, to put down those voices, especially in recent years. But yeah, there is a division, particularly within American Catholicism, about these things.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Wow. Yeah. So I know of the kind of backlash to Francis because yeah, he's from the global South, um, and he preaches the social gospel, right? And
I mean, he kind of rejects the all of the trappings, the elaborate liturgical vestments. He wears scuffed black shoes that he's owned for 20 years. He lives in a modest apartment rather than the palace. And a lot of what attracts people to Catholicism, and I don't want this to come off the wrong way, but a lot of these, not all of them, but a lot of these very influential people, including J.D. Vance, are converts to Catholicism.
hmm
And that is, it's striking how many are converts to Catholicism. Not all of them, but many of them. And the converts are not, by and large, converting because of social justice issues. They're converting because of kind of the um, the power, the things that the 19th century Protestants were worried about
hmm
Catholicism are the things that are now kind of like they were actually there, and now they are the thing that is sort of attracting people.
the hierarchy, yeah.
Hierarchy, the rituals, and I mean, I'm very not down on rituals, but sort of this authoritarian hierarchy that people like John F. Kennedy had to say, "Oh, no, 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 no. I'm not obedient to that." Now, there are many Catholics in positions of political power who, while not obedient to the Pope, are definitely interested in this monarchy, this monarchical version of Christianity that traditional Catholicism embodies. Where
I
Francis is trying in some ways to kind of tone that down. He just
mhm.
wants to live modestly. There's so many stories about him, kind of um wanting to, in his early days of his papacy, like book his own plane tickets and, instead of on Holy Thursday, instead of washing the feet of, these other high ranking church officials, he goes and washes the feet of, you know, prostitutes who are
Mhm.
refugees from places. He is deliberately trying to overturn some of those or question some of those hierarchical model, even from his position of being at the top of it. And that is not attractive to many people who are turning to or rediscovering Catholicism in America.
Wow. So, I mean, it sounds like this, in a way, this is a rift between like global North, global South. You know, the rich countries, the poor countries. All Catholicism is largely picking up its new gains in the global South, right?
Mhm.
Like that's where most of the people are coming in.
Yeah, that's true. But um, but like in Central and South America, there's also huge exodus away from Catholicism too,
Mm-hmm.
as Pentecostal religions and other forms of like charismatic Protestantism are taking hold.
Yeah.
It's really not clear, where the church is headed when you look at it, such a complicated picture.
So obviously, there's got to be people in the church, in the church hierarchy, who are working um, against the Pope.
Mm,
From within the organization.
mhm.
I've heard of a couple guys. There's this guy down in Texas named Bishop Strickland,
Strickland.
and he
Yes.
was way out there. But
And he
I
was
mean,
removed by the Pope from his position as bishop in 2023 because of
yeah,
his, explicit rejection of Francis and his authority.
and so let's go back to Vatican II when this sort of split occurs. Is there are there personalities uh kind of in the immediate aftermath of that that are sort of heading this backlash?
Yeah, there was a guy, a French priest, Marcel Lefebvre, um, and he was ultimately excommunicated. There were movements of Catholics that are called, uh, always with the Latin, sed evacantists, which means the chair is empty. That means the chair of Peter is empty. That they don't acknowledge the legitimacy of the Pope. Mel Gibson has been affiliated with some of these groups.
Huh.
Yeah, so in the past, but in general, in the immediate aftermath of Vatican II, that was just sort of church. It was those were fringe elements. They are no longer fringe elements, is what I would say. So in the 70s and 80s, people who rejected Vatican II were very few and far between and had no authority to speak of on the political landscape. That is definitely no longer true. And if people are like the people who overtly reject Francis, outwardly say he's, those people, there still aren't too many of them, but people who um, kind of softly reject
Yeah.
Francis, far more common, and reject the Second Vatican Council, far more common. And you see that in many, many contexts.
One of the guys I know who rejected Vatican II and was very active in just the formation of the modern right as
Mhm.
we think of it in this country is Paul Weyrich.
Yes.
And he is one of the founders of the Heritage Foundation, who is very much in the news right now for Project 2025, their plan for a second Trump administration, which is like an authoritarian nightmare.
Mm-hmm. He was so interesting because he partnered with Jerry Falwell,
Hmm.
and the Moral Majority. That was like the late 70s, like 78, if I'm not mistaken. That was an early alliance between Catholic and evangelical forces. Uh, that was, and Falwell kind of was the front guy, but
Mm.
he and Weyrich worked behind the scenes on that Moral Majority for years. And he was, I would absolutely say he was a pioneer of he died, I think, in 2006, Weyrich, but he was able to really lay a foundation. And he, like many of these people, I would say, and I know you talked about this with the New Apostolic Reformation stuff too, but anti-democratic, not
Yeah.
in favor of the democratic process. Paul Weyrich said, I don't want everyone to vote.
Hmm.
Elections are not won by a majority of people. Our leverage goes up as the voting populace goes down. I mean, that could be said today. That was something said 20 years ago or more. But he was a forerunner of. Mhm.
I mean, if you can pin one person or pin on one person the manufacturing of abortion into a national issue,
Mhm.
it's him, right? Because that was only a Catholic issue until the mid 70s.
Mhm.
I believe after Roe versus Wade, the Southern Baptist Convention was like, this is the right decision.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. There was some reticence around it, but I think one thing that you have, like, if you when you're talking about Catholics being opposed to abortion, even that is not what you think. So yes, it was a Catholic issue, but it was um, a Catholic issue until the 1880s. Abortion really wasn't an issue until quickening, or the time when the baby
Mhm.
can be felt
Yeah,
moving.
no one knew. Yeah.
And it's also, though, although if you look at, Catholic literature, they'll say, well, the Catholic Church has been opposed to abortion since the first century. Um, that is sort of true, but the idea that Catholics are opposed to abortion, or any Christians opposed to abortion because it's murder, is very, very, very recent. um, Catholics who do have a longer history of opposition to abortion were opposed to it because it was a means of covering up sexual sins.
Mm.
And that's not the same as saying it's wrong because it's murder. So early Christians wanted to distinguish themselves from pagans who were sexually licentious, and early Christianity developed, back to the nuns and the monks, as an ascetic religion where people would deny
Yeah.
flesh, and celibacy is part of that, of course. And so abortion covers up sexual sins.
Mm.
You're not taking responsibility for the affair or the premarital sex or whatever you're doing if you have an abortion. And so that's really where it's where the problem lies. Illicit sex is the problem, not the fetus being, you know, this person.
Oh, I see. I didn't know that. I figured it had to do with the same sort of strain that, like, the term pro-life was originally anti-death penalty,
Mhm.
as I recall.
Yeah.
And that phraseology got co-opted by the anti-abortion movement, kind
And
of
now,
right around the same time Paul Weyrich getting involved in
yeah,
big politics. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, so a lot of this stuff, so it's uh 1965, 60s, Catholics, you start to hear talking about abortion as the taking of a life, and primarily a sin based on that. And then, but even that corresponds with a great invention, right? The pill, right? And so the pill covers up sexual sins, right? You can do what you like once the pill comes around, and that is a big fear. So all of this stuff kind of intersects, even within
Mm.
Catholicism. Um, this idea that you're talking about the death penalty, euthanasia, that's the seamless garment, a consistent ethic of life. That's articulated in 1974. Um, so even for Catholics, the idea that abortion is wrong, sure, you can find a lot of evidence for that, and
Hmm.
you know, but why is it wrong? Because it's murdering of a human life. That does not go all the way back.
Huh. That is
Right?
fascinating.
Mhm. You know,
So, go
yeah.
ahead.
No, so there's, and if you think about it, scientific developments need to develop before you can uh, claim that life begins at conception. I mean, you need a microscope to know what
Yeah.
conception actually is. And so you wouldn't have known that 1,500 years ago. Or
Yeah, like, I don't even think they had ultrasound when I was a child. Like, I don't think my mom has ultrasound pictures of baby me anywhere, you
no,
know?
that didn't exist for me. So yes, so this idea of ultrasounds, all of this contributes to the idea of fetal personhood, and all of that, and those things, you know, weren't possible before they were possible, and so people didn't think those ways.
Hmm. So Wyrick makes a fascinating bridge character because he
Mhm.
sort of straddles that era and brings us into um what I would say is like the Catholic takeover of the judicial system.
Yeah, yeah, and
And
he
Leonard
seems.
Leo and the Federalist Society and all of that.
Mhm.
So let's pick up with those guys.
Yeah. Well, Leonard Leo, um, I think has been flying under the radar for an incredibly long time, and is only really in the last few years becoming clear to people outside of a very small circle how incredibly influential this man is,
Mhm.
and has been. You know, he was involved going all the way back to Clarence Thomas, who is one of his very closest friends. That's a long time ago now. That is my first political memories of political awakenings are watching those confirmation hearings.
Mhm. Mhm.
The fact that
Yeah.
that man, that is a long time ago. It was at 91,
Oh,
you know.
that's some kind of gross stuff to, like, politically wake up into.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was bad. So he goes all the way back to that. He was a young man then. He is responsible for basically picking all three of Trump's justices. They came directly from a short list that he supplied. Um, and he also, but so that's really important. But I think his importance is so much bigger and deeper than that, even if it's possible to say. So he is it's impo I don't have the time. I haven't had the time to I don't know if anyone has to there's a few good pieces out there in Vox and other places, but to unpack the web that he has created and contributed to would be a project, that would take years.
Yeah,
He has so
completely.
many um organizations, think tanks, public relations initiatives. He involved in higher education,
Mm,
so many things. So, for example,
a
he
lot of
has
tentacles, yeah.
a public relations firm, um, and it's called CRC Advisors. That sounds pretty bland. This is a coordinated social media campaign, and not just social media, but media in general, op-eds, social media, um, speakers that is aimed at getting these ideas, these far right ideas into, like everywhere. His involvement in the Supreme Court is not just here's a list of justices, but it goes down to influencing which cases are going to get focused on
Mhm.
in order to get them to the level where they can reach those justices so they can be ruled on, and that takes a network of so many places and people that are working, in the far lower levels. And of course, he's also i- i- these things are funded to an extra $500 million, that
Yeah.
that you could and more, so it's he's incredibly influential and powerful. Let it go.
Yeah, just like, well, every all 6 conservative Supreme Court justices have ties to him,
Hmm.
either very close ties or, kinda tangential ties.
Yeah,
I am to understand that he is a member of an organization called Opus Dei.
yeah.
I hear that name come up a lot with some of, these high profile, far right
Hmm.
Catholic folks like Leo.
Hmm.
What can you tell us about that organization?
Well, Opus Dei is it's very interesting. It is quite s- it's somewhat secretive, right? So members of Opus Dei, I do not advertise that they're members of Opus Dei usually, and I think that they even might have to have permission to say that they're an Opus Dei. So what Opus Dei is, it means in Latin the work of God, God's work. It is some people maybe have encountered it if they were watching or reading the Da Vinci Code about 20 years ago,
Mm,
because the spooky, um, like I think, and some guy who's like whipping himself and he's like some nefarious guy. He's a member of Opus Dei in the Da Vinci Code, So it's people might have heard of it through that. But what it is it's an organization that was founded in the late 1920s in 1928. Um, and this man who has since or this priest who has since been canonized as a saint, and his name was Jose Maria Escriva. He had what he describes as a vision that he needed to start Opus Dei. So that is right there. People in Opus Dei believe it is of supernatural origin. It's not just a group of people who come together because they believe in a certain thing.
Mhm.
That gives something a particular power. And like the people who are, Dutch Sheets and some of these other people who believe they're getting direct revelation, that's one of the things about Catholics too, like and that's one of the things that made them suspect to the Puritans.
I thought God only talked to the Pope, and then the Pope passes things on.
Well, he people, there are visionaries in the Catholic tradition. That's the thing that the Puritans were like, no way. God only speaks through the Bible. And if God's talking to you, it's not God, it's the devil, and we're going to put you on trial for witchcraft. But Pentecostalism and Puritanism are far,
Yeah.
far from each other, right? So Catholics do have this kind of thing where they have visionaries. And so Opus Dei was founded by someone who believed he was being told by God to found it. Gives it a certain uh, kind of authority just directly from God that way. It's an organization that believes that regular life, secular work, ordinary life should be sanctified. So whatever we do, if we're a businessman, a lawyer, a lobbyist, wealthy public relations executive, or whatever we may be, or a plumber or a carpenter,
Mhm.
whatever, that your life should be lived as in the secular world, but as a life of holiness. And so you're going to possibly so you become part of this organization, and then it is the type of organization Opus Dei is called a personal prelature, and it's the only one. So a prelate is like a bishop or a leader. So here in Wisconsin, our bishop is of the Green Bay Diocese is named David Ricken, and so all of our priests are kind of under him, and everybody, But Opus Dei is a prelature without a territory. There is a leader, and everyone in Opus Dei is under that leader, even though it's not geographically bounded and it's the only one. So that's kind of interesting. Um, Opus Dei is somewhat secretive. You don't necessarily go around advertising that you're in it. Most of the people in it are living in the world. A certain percentage kind of live a separate life, almost in like a community, but that's a small
Mhm.
percentage. Most of the people who are in it are members, and they meet maybe a couple times a year, but they commit to certain practices and certain ways of thinking. And um, bodily mortification is part of that. So that means, like, I'm not in it, but what I've read is, like you sleep on a board, or some people in it, or just sleep on the floor one night a week, or um, some wear this thing around their leg that kind of cuts into your leg, and causes pain, and you offer up that pain as sort of a devotional practice.
Kinda like a mild self-flagellation.
Yes, exactly. And that's, and as a scholar of religion, like, I mean, that's something that is is part of religious practice in
Mhm.
various places. Asceticism, kind of making yourself aware um, of pain or of your body in order to kind of transcend those feelings and purify yourself. These are common things, so that doesn't necessarily make it, that's strange, but it is a very, I would say, the people who join it are traditionalist Catholics. It sort of harkens back to a type of Catholicism that is a traditionalist pre-Vatican II type of Catholicism.
And it sounds
So
um, like the goal is to sort of take over all of society and shape it in this very Catholic way where, you go to work and that's kinda, I mean, it's sanctified. Is it, like, overseen by the church or the church controls everything? It
yeah,
sounds
Yeah, I
kind
mean,
of authoritarian.
it's trying to get that religious life into every aspect of society. So that's where it appeals. Um, and so Leonard Leo, I mean, I don't know, like, because I don't have a list of members, but I think there are quite a few clues that he is in Opus Dei. Um, one of those is his involvement with a place in Washington, D.C. called the Catholic Information Center, CIC. I don't know if you've heard of this.
Mm,
But this is like kind of I don't know what it is. I guess it's like a place.
sounds innocuous enough, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's a place in Washington for people to come and network as right-wing Catholics. And he's really involved in that place. And this is strange, but one thing, so Leonard Leo had a daughter who died, and she had spina bifida,
Oh,
and she died at age 14 after living, with this genetic or thing that caused her a lot of pain as a child.
yeah, yeah.
And Clarence Thomas has a picture of this child on his desk, and there is a painting of her, and she's called Margaret Leo of what's the city in Virginia where they live? I just lost it. But Margaret Leo of, let's say, Arlington, but it's not Arlington, Virginia. There's a painting of her in this Catholic information center, and she's sort of like being depicted as a saint. And people are encouraged to pray for her intercession, this deceased child of Leonard Leo. So I think, and that Opus Dei affiliated Catholic Information Center, his deceased daughter is venerated as a kind of a saint. So I mean, like, that is a pretty good clue that he's quite
Yeah.
involved with it,
I
right?
mean, that's like really sweet, but also kind of getting into idolatry.
Yeah, it's very, and it's also like it's a form of Catholicism that elevates people to sainthood not because of their good acts, but because of their suffering. And so she's like considered like a suffering soul, which is, and I mean, that to me shows, though, that Leonard Leo is not just a political operative using Catholicism as a cover for, you know, like he's a true believer.
He's a true believer, yeah.
He's a true believer. And to the point where he believes that his daughter is like interceding, his deceased daughter interceding, like on behalf of people to, as a saint.
Yeah.
Isn't that
That
interesting?
that's hard to it's hard to deal with the true believer. Because the cynical political operative, I get that. But I can't put myself in that guy's head. I have a hard time with it. Yeah.
He is a true believer. And he, I mean, Clarence Thomas was somewhat raised Catholic, but not practicing. He was divorced. Leonard Leo and Samuel Alito kind of have brought him back to Catholicism. Ginny Thomas converted to Catholicism in 2002. And I think this Leonard Leo, Samuel Alito kind of branch of, is responsible.
Just us guys with our appeal to heaven flags. Don't mind us. Yeah. Well, so who is Cardinal Raymond Burke? Because you said he's kind of closely connected to all these figures, and hey, he's a cardinal. Sounds like he's in the church.
So Cardinal Burke is, he was born in Wisconsin. He became bishop of La Crosse, Wisconsin, which is the southwestern part of the state. He was consecrated as bishop by John Paul II. And then he rose to ever increasing higher, sort of power within the church under Benedict. So he is a traditionalist Catholic. He was a canon lawyer. He was responsible for he was kind of a person who would um, judge whether something was truly Catholic or not, sort of in Rome. And then he also, where I started to learn about him is that he built a shrine to Our Lady of Guadalupe in La Crosse, and Our Lady of Guadalupe is a apparition that took place in Mexico in the 16th century, extremely important to Mexican and Mexican Americans, Our Lady of Guadalupe. But there aren't too many Mexican Americans in La Crosse. Our Lady of Guadalupe was named patroness of the unborn by John Paul II. And so Burke's interest in Guadalupe is not about, the Mexican people so much as it is about her role as the protector of the unborn. And there's a whole thing at that shrine in La Crosse about, anti-LGBTQ, all of these things. So it's a kind of a type of traditionalist Catholicism, theological perspective made into a physical space. So Burke has walked the line with Francis, but just barely. So he has been critical of Francis since the beginning. Francis's willingness to talk about divorce. Francis is wanting to include LGBTQ people and not condemn, and all of that has been really pushed back by Burke, and so he was basically demoted by Francis from his positions of power to some largely ceremonial positions within the church. He was also, and this was a really, really incredible move, I think just a year ago or so, Francis took away his elaborate apartment in Rome, which was being paid for by the church, and put him in some like Spartan housing, just like took the apartment away from him. Burke loves the pageantry. He never met a 30-foot embroidered vestment that he didn't love, and so he is totally opposed to Francis, but more than a difference in style, or because the church is big enough to accommodate a lot of different perspectives. Traditional Catholics and sort of the guitar Catholics have coexisted for a long time, and there's lots of different branches. What's more interesting about Burke, I think, is that he has become a promoter of conspiracy theories around COVID, around climate change. He, so that's where you see him really becoming captured by some of these issues. So he called it the Wuhan virus, and then he refused to get vaccinated, and then he nearly died. He was on a ventilator for weeks when he got it, because he's a man. So he was also quite closely involved in some initiatives with Steve Bannon. And then he cut ties with Steve Bannon's,
Bannon's another traditional radical Catholic, is he not? Yeah.
Yes, he is. Yes, he is, with a lot of, access to avenues of power. And Burke was working closely with him. Now he's publicly cut ties with him. I mean, Bannon's in jail now, right?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah.
At the moment. Yeah. So, so Burke he is, known as the leader of, in some circles, as a leader of American opposition to Francis, but he has stopped short of a person like Strickland in Texas, who went so far that he got his position taken away. He's not walking up to the line of excommunication, but he's saying well, of course, I respect the authority of the Pope. It's just that he is so in confusion, and I would like to correct him on these matters, so he's sort of doing it that way. But meanwhile, he has a lot of sway with powerful right-wing Catholics. I think staying you know, uh, within the church is a more powerful than it getting kicked out.
Yeah. Wow. So, I know I've only got you for like another couple minutes, and there's so much I would
Yeah,
love to be able to cover. Like, the Knights of Malta is still a thing, I
well, that's
guess, and
that's what Burke got. Instead of being like in a position of real authority, the Pope gave him you're the spiritual advisor of the Knights of Malta.
mm,
So yeah,
okay.
yeah, and I don't really know a whole lot about that group. I know you asked me about like the People of Praise. Um,
Yeah, that's was Amy Coney Barrett's kind of
mhm. Yes,
sub community of. I mean, she's Catholic, and
yeah,
she was Notre Dame, and
yeah, and they're in Indiana. That I think one of their main kind of like centers, the People of Praise, is in South Bend. That as I understand that group, that was an outgrowth of the Catholic Charismatic Renewal movement of the 60s and 70s, which was like Catholics that would speak in tongues,
mm,
that the Holy Spirit is pouring out charismatic renewal on Catholics as well. And I had an aunt and uncle who were into that in the 70s, and I remember it. It was a thing. So People of Praise is part of that. At, People of Praise is mostly Catholic, but not exclusively. It's nominally ecumenical
yeah,
group.
it sounds Pentecostal. Yeah,
Mhm. And it is mostly Catholic, but it's like Pentecostalism in Catholicism. And so because of that, and again, I don't know that much about it, but I think it's both traditionalist and not in some ways, as Pentecostalism can be. So there's traditionalist Catholics who are drawn to People of Praise, but then it also has this sort of like communal early church vibe, so
yeah.
it's and Pentecostalism too, was
Yeah, well, that's what they're going for. It sounds like, well, like Dr. Taylor said, it was trying to recreate that the early church with the apostles and the
exactly,
prophets and
exactly.
stuff.
When the Holy Spirit was sent down. So, I mean, I looked into the People of Praise a little bit. Women do not have power in People of Praise.
Irony.
And yeah, it's patriarchal. Until 2017, women were referred to as handmaids um, in this. So that gives you a sense. But on the other hand, it's also like it's very communal. So what I've read is that people will get together and like rebuild somebody's roof together, or gather resources when somebody's
Yeah,
in a terrible car accident. And,
yeah.
so
Mutual aid. Yeah,
yeah. So it's got, all those dimensions to it. And I wonder, I mean, I haven't looked into this, but I wonder if some of that accounts for the sometimes surprising things that Amy Coney Barrett will care about. Like she hasn't walked the line of like total cruelty.
yeah, yeah. Some of her
In some way.
decisions are like,
Yeah, like, where did that
yeah,
come from? A decision that you would never get from Alito, you might get from her. So I wonder, and I think that would, I haven't researched that, but I wonder if you knew more about the priorities of People of Praise, if that would make some sense, or if some, inferences could be drawn there. I'm not doing that. I haven't looked into it, but who knows? Yeah. So these are not all the same. Like People of Praise and Opus Dei are different,
sure, sure.
you know,
Yeah,
but they are different kind of groups within the American Catholic Church that draw traditionalist Catholics.
fascinating. I could pick your brain all night. Before I let you go, where can the people find you?
Oh, yes. So, you can read. Oh, well, I write for Religion Dispatches, and I have written quite a few smaller pieces on people like Burke, on some of the ways. That's kind of my niche at Religion Dispatches. If your listeners are familiar, I would highly recommend the takes at Religion Dispatches. They're pretty much hot takes if it's in the news one day, 2 days later, there'll be a take on Religion Dispatches. So I've written quite a bit for them, as well as I've written for Sojourners Magazine and a couple of other uh, online and print sites like that. My book is American Patroness. It's about Marian shrines and the making of U.S. Catholicism. And I'm at St. Norbert College, and you can email me there.
Great stuff. Dr. Karen Park, thank you so much for joining the HoosLeft podcast.
All right. Thanks for inviting me.
Thanks. Once again, that was Dr. Karen Park, professor of theology and religious studies at St. Norbert College, with fascinating insight into the workings of the Catholic Church in America. And here's the one big thing I'll take away from that conversation. As much as we might imagine the Roman Catholic Church as a purely hierarchical, top-down organization speaking with a unified voice, dissent, faction, and infighting abound. No such large institution is a monolith. The same church both did the Crusades and invented hospitals, the Spanish Inquisition, and the Sistine Chapel. They imprisoned Galileo, yet gave us Gregor Mendel. Archconservative Pope Benedict, followed by the progressive, as popes go, Francis. And in the current political moment, liberal Democrats like Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi, and Sonia Sotomayor, as well as far-right reactionaries like Mike Flynn and Steve Bannon, Leonard Leo and J.D. Vance. That's a huge rift, but I think that's normal. We have to be able to hold both things in our head at the same time. That internal battle, the push and pull, the struggle of ideas takes place whenever groups of people come together. It even takes within individuals. But generally, the bigger the group, the more the struggle. It's part of the human condition, greed versus generosity, certainty versus curiosity, autocracy versus democracy, love versus fear. Now, many of us on the left have rightly been fearful of Christian nationalism. We saw how close we came to losing American democracy itself on January 6, 2021. We've seen state legislatures undermine public schools and persecute the LGBTQ community. We've seen women lose the fundamental right to control their own reproductive health decisions. With evangelical Protestants, charismatic Pentecostals, and Catholic integralists combining forces, the Christian nationalist behemoth has seemed unstoppable. But the cracks are starting to show. Months of left and liberal commentators, myself included, screaming about Project 2025 finally caught on, pinning the incredibly unpopular, extremist, regressive agenda on Donald Trump. His selection of Kevin Roberts' fanboy J.D. Vance as his running mate only further tied Trump to the project. As more and more Americans become aware of the things some Christian nationalists believe in, faith healing, literal angels and demons, territorial spiritual warfare, fertilized eggs are full people with human rights, the superiority of Latin Mass, they're beginning to realize that, yeah, these guys are scary, but they're also just incredibly weird. As Kamala Harris has overtaken Trump in the polls, you can see the wheels starting to come off this Christian fundamentalist runaway train. MAGA racists attack Vance's Indian American wife. Trump tries to moderate abortion because he knows it's an election loser and throws Vance under the bus as the weird one. This alliance is temporary. Protestants and Catholics didn't spend centuries killing each other in Europe over nothing. They have profound disagreements, and even if they were to succeed in winning elections and then undoing democracy, would struggle to build the kingdom of God because they don't see eye to eye on what that means. These disparate elements of the religious right, evangelicals, Pentecostals, Catholics, are all nominally Christian. But in the end, they truly only share a belief in one thing: power. Without achieving it, I am hopeful this coalition will descend into schism and then irrelevance. Let's give them the push they need this fall. Thanks for listening. Thanks again to Dr. Karen Park. I've linked to her author page at Religion, Dispatches, and Sojourners in the show notes. I've also linked to bookshop.org, where you can buy her book, American Patroness, Marian Shrines and the Making of U.S. Catholicism. Even better, pick up a copy from your local independent bookseller. If you've got some money left after that purchase, head on over to scottaaronrogers.substack.com and help me expand our pro-democracy footprint with a paid subscription. That's where you'll find everything I publish, and you can also find me on social media on Facebook, Blue Sky, YouTube, and TikTok at HoosLeft, and on most other sites at ScottRog78. Please give me feedback, tips, ideas, and concerns. My DMs are open, or email me at scottrog78@gmail.com. Forward the show to a friend, and have them forward it to another friend. Let's keep building this project and a democratic Indiana, brick by brick. Until next time, this has been the Who's Left podcast. I'm Scott Aaron Rogers. Love each other, Indiana.